The Uber pulled up to the curb, and I sat there for a second longer than I needed to, just looking at it. My little yellow house with the white shutters, the hydrangeas I'd planted along the front walk were blooming, big, full clusters of dusty blue. I'd ordered those bulbs from a catalog in February, paid extra for overnight shipping because I wanted them in the ground before I left for Alaska. 8 months later, they had bloomed without me. That should have been the first beautiful thing I saw coming home. Instead, I saw my mother standing on the front porch with a glass of white wine, watching two men in gray t-shirts carry my couch through the front door, not out of a moving truck. Out of my house. My couch. The cream linen one I'd saved up for. The one with the slightly crooked left leg I kept meaning to fix. It cleared the door frame, wobbled between the two men, and then disappeared into the back of a white cargo van parked in my driveway. My driveway. I paid the driver, grabbed my duffel, and stood on the sidewalk in my work jacket, still smelling like diesel and North Slope wind, trying to process what I was seeing. My mother raised her glass in something that wasn't quite a greeting. My brother Finn leaned against the porch railing next to her, scrolling his phone like this was any ordinary afternoon. "You're back early," my mother said. I wasn't. I was back exactly on time. My name is Josephine, but everyone calls me Jo. I'm 32 years old. For the past 4 years, I've worked as a process safety engineer on a rotating schedule, 8 weeks on, 3 weeks off, at an oil production facility on the North Slope of Alaska. It is not glamorous work. It is cold and loud and relentless, and I love it because it pays well, it requires my full attention, and when I'm up there, nobody calls me asking for money. I bought my house in Tulsa, Oklahoma when I was 28. 1,100 square feet, 1 story, a foundation that had been checked 3 times before I signed anything. I paid $214,000 and I cried in the parking lot of the title company afterward because I had done it alone and I had done it right. My father had been dead for 2 years by then, and I had used part of my inheritance, $40,000, as a down payment. The rest was mine, built rotation by rotation, saved in a high-yield account I checked religiously every Sunday morning. I had also, before my last deployment to the slope, set up a revocable living trust on the advice of my estate attorney. It wasn't complicated. It just meant that the house, along with my savings account and my car, was now owned by the Joe Whitfield Revocable Trust, not by Josephine Whitfield, the individual. My attorney had been very clear about why this mattered. It meant that even if someone had legal authority to act on my behalf, they couldn't touch assets held by the trust without being a named trustee. My mother was not a named trustee. I didn't tell her that. She had called me 6 weeks into my rotation, crying so hard I could barely understand her. Finn was in trouble, real trouble this time. He owed $85,000 to a private lender, some man named Gerald who operated somewhere between a pawn shop and a lawsuit, depending on what served him that day. Finn had borrowed the money to invest in a food truck that had lasted 4 months before the transmission died and the business partner disappeared. Gerald wanted his money back. Gerald had, according to my mother, implied that he had people. I had listened to all of it from a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, watching snow hit the window at a 45-degree angle, and I had said the same thing I always said. "I can't, Mom. I'm sorry, but I can't keep doing this." And she had said what she always said, "He's your brother. Joe, family takes care of family." I had hung up and gone back to work. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that 2 days after that phone call, my mother had located the power of attorney document I'd signed 3 years earlier. I'd given it to her in case of emergency. Medical decisions. Bank access if I was incapacitated. The kind of document you give someone because you trust them and you haven't yet learned exactly how that trust can be shaped into a tool. She found a real estate attorney who apparently did not ask enough questions. She listed my house. She accepted a cash offer of $268,000 from a real estate investor named Deborah, who was buying up properties in my zip code for a rental portfolio. Closing happened 6 days before I landed back in Tulsa, while I was still on the slope finishing my final shift rotation. I didn't find out until I was standing on my own sidewalk watching my couch leave. I walked up the porch steps slowly, not because I was hesitating, because I was counting my own breaths, the way I'd learned to do during safety audits when something had gone wrong, and I needed to be the person who stayed calm. 4 in. Hold. 4 out. The person who panics is never the person who fixes the problem. Mom. I kept my voice level. What is happening right now? She took a sip of wine. I had to, Joe. You weren't here. Finn needed help and you weren't here. And we had to do something. You listed my house. We used the power of attorney. It was legal. She said it like she'd rehearsed it, like someone had told her to lead with that. Your father always said, this family comes first. Your father would have understood. There it was. She'd pulled out my father 18 seconds in. A new record. Finn looked up from his phone finally. He was wearing new sneakers. Bright white, the kind with the thick sole that cost $300. He must have seen me look at them because he shifted his weight, tucking one foot slightly behind the other. It wasn't personal, he said. You don't even live here half the year. I live here all of the year, Finn. I work somewhere else. That's different. Gerald was going to... I know what Gerald was going to do. I looked at him directly. What did you use after the house sale? What did you actually spend it on? He didn't answer. But I could see the sneakers. And now that I was looking, the watch? Not a Rolex. Finn didn't have that kind of taste, but a Breitling. Chunky and silver and absolutely purchased in the last 2 weeks. The buyer, I said, turning back to my mother. Is she still inside? Don't you dare make a scene. My mother's voice dropped. The papers are signed. The money cleared. Deborah is finishing the walkthrough. This is done, Joe. It is done. And you need to accept that your brother needed help and this family... I just want to introduce myself, I said, and walk through my own front door. The house smelled like lemon cleaning product, and something floral that wasn't mine. Most of my furniture was still there. The big stuff, the pieces the movers hadn't gotten to yet, but there were blue painter's tape marks on some of the walls, and a woman in a blazer was standing in my kitchen taking photographs of the countertops. Deborah was probably 50, efficient-looking, with reading glasses pushed up into highlighted hair. She turned when she heard me come in, and her expression did the quick calculation that investors do. Not threat, not friend, complication. You must be the daughter, she said. She didn't say it warmly. I'm the owner, I said. She smiled, tight and patient. Honey, I have a signed deed. The sale closed 6 days ago. Your mother had power of attorney. Everything was properly executed. I've been doing this for 19 years. She went back to photographing the countertop. I understand. This is upsetting. I do. But the law is the law. It is, I agreed. I unzipped the interior pocket of my work jacket. I want to explain something about working in process safety. Your entire job is anticipating failure. You spend your days asking what happens if this valve sticks? What happens if this sensor fails? What happens if the person who's supposed to check this thing doesn't check it? You build redundancies. You document everything. You prepare for scenarios that most people assume will never happen, because most people don't understand that things fail all the time. They just usually fail quietly. I had applied that same framework to my family approximately 4 years ago, after Finn's first crisis, the one involving a sublease agreement and a friend's credit card, and had called an estate attorney the following Monday. What I pulled out of my jacket pocket was a certified copy of the deed transfer, notarized and dated 8 months ago, transferring my property from Josephine Whitfield to the Joe Whitfield Revocable Trust. I set it on my kitchen counter, next to Deborah's hand. The power of attorney my mother used authorizes her to act on behalf of Josephine Whitfield, I said. But Josephine Whitfield doesn't own this house. She hasn't owned it for 8 months. The Joe Whitfield Revocable Trust owns it. My mother is not a trustee. She had no authority to sell a trust asset. I kept my voice the way I kept it during incident reports. Factual, precise, no performance. Which means the deed she signed is fraudulent. Which means the sale is void. Deborah stopped taking photographs. She picked up the document. Read it. Turned it over. Read it again. The color change was gradual and then all at once, like watching milk cloud into coffee. She set the paper down very carefully. Where, she said, not looking up, is your mother? My mother had followed me inside at some point. She was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, still holding her wine, though her grip had tightened. You told me you had authority, Deborah said, turning to her. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something moving underneath it, the way you can feel a truck engine through the floor before you hear it. I have the power of attorney I showed it to. You showed me a document that doesn't cover this asset. Deborah held up the trust deed. Her composure was cracking into something colder. I wired $268,000 based on your representation of ownership. Do you understand what that means? My mother looked at me. Joe, tell her. Tell her it's a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Mom. We can work something out. Finn had appeared in the kitchen doorway now. Look, we can. Where is my money? Deborah turned to him. Not a question. A wall. Some of it went to Gerald, Finn said. The loan. We had to pay Gerald first. And then, how much? 85. And then there were fees. And how much is left? The silence that followed answered for him. Deborah had her phone out. She was already dialing. I stepped back and leaned against the sink and let it happen the way you let a controlled burn do its work. You don't interfere. You just make sure the fire breaks are in place. I need to report a fraudulent real estate transaction, she said into the phone. Yes, I'll hold. My mother set her wine glass down on the counter. It made a small, final sound. You planned this, she said to me. Her voice had shifted from defensive to something quieter and harder. You set us up. I set myself up, I said. I protected my assets before I went to work 8 months ago. You made your own choices. You knew we'd need money. You knew Finn was in trouble. You could have helped, and you chose not to. Her eyes were filling, but it was the angry kind of crying, the kind that has no softness in it. I did what I had to do for my son, and you just stood there and let me walk into this. I had thought about this conversation. Not this exact version of it, but the shape of it. The part where she reframed her choices as my failure. The part where she became the victim of the trap she had built. I gave you a power of attorney for emergencies, I said. Medical decisions, if I was hurt up there and couldn't speak for myself. Not so you could liquidate my home while I was earning the salary you've called me selfish for earning. I looked at her steadily. I asked you to be someone I could trust. That was the only thing I ever asked. 2 police officers arrived 19 minutes later. Deborah had also, at some point, made a second call, and her attorney was on the phone providing guidance in short, precise bursts that I could hear faintly from across the kitchen. The officers took statements. My mother cried, the soft kind. Now, the kind that looks like remorse. And my brother stood with his arms crossed, staring at the kitchen floor. Then one of the officers asked to see the trust document and the original POA, and while he was reviewing them, Finn crossed the kitchen to me. He was quiet for a moment, then, drop it. I looked at him. Drop the whole thing. Tell her you don't want to press charges. Tell them it was a family misunderstanding. His voice was low and even. He thought he was being reasonable. Because if you don't, I'm going to call your HR department and tell them you've been running a side business using company equipment. I have emails. I have documentation. I almost felt something like pity. Almost. Finn, I said. I work in process safety for a federally regulated facility. My communications are logged. My equipment usage is audited. If you fabricated documents to that effect, you're not threatening me. You're creating evidence against yourself. He blinked. And if you actually have something real, I added, then the time to use it was before you stole my house, not after, as leverage. Because that's extortion. I raised my hand slightly toward the officer who had just looked up from the documents. Officer, my brother is attempting to extort me with what he's claiming is falsified professional documentation. I want that on record. Finn's hand tightened around his phone. I'd hold on to that, I said quietly. They'll probably want it as evidence. They cuffed him in my kitchen, next to the countertops he'd helped my mother sell, while his new sneakers squeaked against my original hardwood floor. My mother was escorted out separately, still crying, still turning back to look at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. Maybe she would always see it that way. I had stopped needing her to see it differently. When they were gone, I stood alone in my kitchen for a long time. The movers had left. The cargo van was gone. The house was almost entirely intact. Just the couch missing and a lamp from the living room and the small blue rug I'd bought at a flea market in Tulsa 3 years ago for $11. I'd get another rug. I'd already filed an emergency motion with my attorney to formalize the title chain and document the fraudulent transaction before anything could complicate the record. I walked to the front door and looked out. My hydrangeas were still there, still blue, still full, still mine. My attorney called at 7 that evening. She was efficient and thorough and had the particular energy of someone who genuinely enjoys watching their work hold. She walked me through what would happen next. Criminal charges for my mother would likely be reduced to a civil matter given her age and no prior record. Wire fraud, fraudulent conveyance, misuse of fiduciary authority. Finn's charges were more serious, extortion layered on top of conspiracy to commit fraud. Deborah's attorney had already contacted mine about the wire transfer and the path to recovery. "You're going to be fine," my attorney said. The trust held exactly the way it was supposed to. After she hung up, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd signed the trust documents 8 months ago, on a gray October morning, before I drove myself to the airport with a duffel bag and a to-do list, and the particular loneliness of having no one to drop you off. I had not set a trap. That's what my mother had said, and it wasn't true. I had built a fire break. There is a difference. A trap requires you to want someone to fall. A fire break just requires you to understand what fire does when it has nothing to stop it. My brother pled guilty 4 months later. 2 years probation, mandatory restitution, the Breitling sold as part of asset recovery. My mother entered into a civil settlement with Deborah, a structured repayment agreement that would take years and come largely out of her retirement savings. She didn't speak to me for 6 months. Then she called on a Sunday morning and said she was sorry, and the way she said it was small and genuine in a way I hadn't heard from her before. I didn't forgive her that morning. I said I would think about it. That felt like the truest thing I could offer. The blue rug was gone, and I never did replace it exactly. I found one at an estate sale in Jenks. Darker, with a geometric pattern, nothing like the original, and it was better, actually. It fit the space better. Sometimes what you lose makes room for something that fits more cleanly. I changed the trust documentation to add a secondary trustee, my attorney, with explicit instructions for exactly what constitutes an emergency. I updated the power of attorney to cover only the specific medical scenarios I'd originally intended. I sent both documents to a lockbox and gave the key to a colleague I trusted. Before my next rotation, I drove past the house one morning before dawn. I didn't stop. I just slowed down and looked at it. The white shutters, the hydrangeas gone dormant now for winter, the porch light I left on a timer. Still mine. Quiet and still mine. I drove to the airport and went back to work. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. Not about pressing charges, about letting it get that far. About standing in my own kitchen watching my mother hand her wine glass to a police officer and not doing something sooner to stop it. I don't. And it took me a while to understand why I don't, and to be at peace with that answer. Here's what I've come to believe. The choices that brought my mother and Finn to that kitchen were years in the making. Every time I had wired money I couldn't spare, every time I had said yes when I meant no, every time I had absorbed the consequences of someone else's decisions to keep the peace, I had been quietly communicating that there were no real consequences. That I was a resource, not a person. That love in our family meant self-erasure. I didn't plant that idea. But I had watered it, rotation after rotation, year after year. And eventually it grew into something that believed it could sell my house. What I did, the trust, the documents, the attorney, wasn't strategy in the cold sense. It was the first time in my adult life I had extended to myself the same level of care I had always extended to them. That's all it was. I had simply decided that my future was worth protecting with the same rigor I applied to everything else I valued. That decision, made quietly on an October morning before I drove to the airport, is what held. Finn thought he was being clever with the watch and the sneakers. My mother thought she was being a good parent. Neither of them had thought past the immediate problem, past the transaction, past the moment of relief. That's what happens when the habit is always to take the shortcut. You stop being able to see past the next 30 days. You stop building anything. You just consume what's in reach and tell yourself it was necessary. I am not smarter than my mother. I am not a better person than my brother in any absolute sense. What I had was a practice, a discipline of thinking forward, of asking what happens if, of refusing to leave myself exposed, because I assumed the people around me would always act with integrity. That discipline is not a personality trait you're born with. I built it the same way I built everything else in my life, slowly, with effort, after making enough mistakes to understand what I was protecting against. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. It was the phone call 6 months later, when my mother said she was sorry in that small, genuine way, because forgiveness is its own kind of discipline. It doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It doesn't mean restoring things to what they were. It means choosing not to carry the weight of someone else's worst moment into every room you walk into for the rest of your life. I'm still working on that one. I think I will be for a long time. What I know is this: the hydrangeas bloomed whether I was there or not. The house held. The trust held. And I came home to something that was still mine because I had decided, before I left, that I was worth that kind of care. If you've ever had to protect yourself from the people who are supposed to protect you, you already know how lonely that preparation feels. You also know that it's the loneliness of building something real